Rain slid down the window panes like silent tears. Outside, the world dissolved into a blur. Gray skies folded into darker shadows, and puddles stitched silver trails across the sidewalk. Inside, the quiet was deeper. It wasn't just the hush of a calm home. It was the stillness of absence, one that had settled in the corners, in the unspoken pauses, and the way time moved slower here. Ethan moved through his house like a ghost who still remembered being alive. Every morning began the same way: the hiss of the kettle, the clink of porcelain, the soft shuffle of slippers on hardwood. He made Lily's breakfast with quiet precision to pancakes, one slightly smaller, with strawberries on the side. Just how she liked them. Just how her mother used to make them. He had learned these small rituals not through instinct, but through memory, carefully observed, gently mimicked. Grief had turned him into a man of structure. Every dish, every towel, every bedtime story, in its place, as if order could keep the ache from spreading. By trade, Ethan was an architect. He spent his days designing spaces for others' homes filled with light, warmth, and potential. Yet his own house felt like an unfinished blueprint. Rooms existed, but they echoed. Colors clung to the walls, but nothing truly lived in them anymore, except for Lily and Ethan, trying to fill a role meant for two. She was 5 now, curious, small, and fragile in a way only children can be when they've seen something they shouldn't have to understand. She didn't cry much, not anymore. Instead, she watched with big eyes that searched his face for signals, for shifts in tone, for warmth that sometimes took effort to summon. On most days they managed, on some, they even laughed. But in the quiet moments, the ones just before sleep or during the long hush of a rainy afternoon, grief returned like fog over a still lake. That evening, the rain came heavier, the kind that makes the world feel like it's folding inward, like the sky is remembering something it lost. Ethan sat by the fireplace, pencil in hand, sketching a new design. Lily was curled beside him with her crayons, humming faintly, her bare feet tucked under her. The fire cast slow-moving shadows across the walls, and for a moment it felt safe, almost timeless. Then, softly, so softly it felt like the question had always been there, she asked, "Will someone love you like Mummy did?" The pencil froze in his hand. The sound of the rain seemed to grow louder. He didn't answer, not immediately. His breath caught, like the air had thickened around him. That question, so simple, so impossibly complex. Ethan looked at her. Lily was tracing circles now, unaware, or perhaps too aware of, what she'd done. Children didn't always know how deeply they touched things, but sometimes they knew exactly what they were asking. He thought about love, not the grand sweeping kind that movies showed, but the quiet, steady kind, the kind that made tea at night, that left notes in lunchboxes, that held your hand during silence and still made it feel full. The kind she had given him, the kind he hadn't known how much he needed until it was gone. He didn't know how to explain that to a 5-year-old. He wanted to say yes, that someone might, that hearts find ways to open again, but his voice stayed silent, caught between past and present. And in that silence, something shifted, because it wasn't really an answer Lily needed. It was a presence, a reassurance, that love, in all its forms, wasn't gone, that it still lived in pancakes and bedtime songs and the way he brushed her hair gently before school. That love didn't always have to come back the same way. Sometimes it came through what remains. Ethan placed the sketchpad aside and reached for her hand. It was small, warm, and trusting. He pulled her close, kissed the top of her head, and let the silence be an answer of its own. The house didn't feel less empty, but for a moment it felt more alive. Later that night, as Lily drifted to sleep beneath a quilt her mother once sewed, Ethan stood in the hallway, watching the rain tap against the glass. He let the weight of the day settle into his shoulders, and as he turned out the lights, the ghost of her question still lingered, not to haunt but to remind. Love had not left, it had only changed shape, and somewhere, deep in the quiet architecture of his heart, Ethan began to rebuild, not with blueprints, but with moments. The storm hadn't let up. Sheets of rain poured down the windows in silver ribbons, turning the outside world into a soft blur of movement and shadow. The front garden, once neat, had become a shallow sea of glistening puddles. Tree branches swayed gently, like figures bowing in slow, reverent prayer. The sky had turned the color of wet stone, dim, quiet, and heavy with thought. Inside, Ethan waited near the doorway, glancing at the clock, then back out the window. He wasn't sure why he'd even posted the listing. Perhaps because the days were beginning to blur, because work was slipping behind, because Lily needed someone else, someone more, and maybe, just maybe, because the silence had grown too loud to bear alone. Then came a knock, not sharp, not rushed, just there, present, as if the storm itself had sent her. He opened the door, and she stood there, soaked from head to toe. Rain clung to her hair, her coat, her fingertips. She held a small worn leather bag close to her chest, shielding it from the downpour, and in her other hand, a folded resume slightly bent from the water but still intact. She looked up at him, eyes soft beneath the curtain of damp curls, and smiled. That smile, warm, unhurried, as if the storm hadn't touched her spirit at all. "Hi," she said, her voice barely louder than the rain. "I'm Sophie." Ethan stepped aside without thinking, motioning her in. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air shifted knots dramatically, not loudly but like a quiet chord resolving in the background of a song. The scent of rain followed her in, along with something else. Something faint, like lavender, and warm linen, like memory. He couldn't place it. She handed him the resume with a slight apologetic shrug. Water droplets trailing across her sleeve. He nodded, scanning the faded print but not really reading. Her presence had taken his attention. She didn't ask to dry off. She didn't make small talk. She simply turned her head toward the staircase, toward the sound of Lily's tiny footsteps approaching. And then it happened. Lily didn't hesitate. She didn't hide. Didn't study Sophie with the cautious eyes of a child used to strangers. Instead, she ran forward and clung to her legs, small arms wrapping tightly around Sophie's knee as if she'd been found. Not introduced, Sophie looked down, surprised. "Well, hello," she whispered. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to explain this moment that seemed to bloom all on its own. But Lily, ever observant, only tilted her head up and whispered, "She smells like sunshine." The words hung there in the quiet foyer, suspended like light through a raindrop. Ethan blinked, and for a moment he wasn't in his hallway at all. He was somewhere else, somewhere warmer, somewhere from before. It made no sense, but it made all the sense. There was something familiar about Sophie. Not her face, not her voice, but something underneath. A thread he couldn't see, but could feel pulling gently through the air between them. He watched as Sophie knelt to meet Lily at eye level. She didn't ask questions or reach out too quickly. She simply smiled and waited. And Lily, in that a quiet way of hers, reached up and touched Sophie's cheek with her tiny hand, like checking for something only she could sense. It was an interview, technically. There were questions Ethan should have asked, references to check, dates to confirm, but instead they just sat, for a while, in the living room. Sophie drying slowly in front of the fire, Lily leaning sleepily on her lap, as if she had known her all her life. Sophie spoke little, but when she did, her words were gentle, and she listened more than she talked. She had a presence that didn't fill the room, it softened it, as if she knew how to live inside silences without disturbing them. Ethan tried to trace the feeling she left behind in each room she entered. It wasn't dramatic, not radiant, but familiar, like the scent of a place you once knew, long ago, like the echo of a lullaby. The rain continued for hours, but inside, warmth began to grow. Not like fire, but like memory, like something quietly beginning again. When Sophie finally rose to leave, Lily clung tighter. "Stay," she whispered. Sophie looked to Ethan, not for permission, but for something deeper. He nodded, unsure of what he was agreeing to, only that it felt right, natural, as if her presence, her timing, her smile in the storm had all been waiting for them. She would return tomorrow, she said, early to begin properly. But even as she stepped back into the rain, Ethan felt the quiet shift in his home, like a new beam added to a fragile structure, like sunlight waiting behind gray clouds. And somewhere, in a part of him he hadn't visited in a long while, something stirred, not recognition, but hope. The days began to soften. Mornings that once moved like reluctant clockwork now unfolded with quiet ease. Lily laughed more. The house smelled of cinnamon and warm bread. There were sun-dappled afternoons filled with drawings, soft lullabies in the hallway, and the sound of humming that drifted from the kitchen like a forgotten song remembered just in time. Sophie had become a part of their world so seamlessly, so gently, that it was hard to remember how recent her arrival had been. She moved through the home like someone who'd always known where things belonged. She didn't just care for Lily, she understood her, the kind of understanding that doesn't need instruction. And Ethan noticed not just the warmth she brought into their lives, but the way she carried something quietly behind her smile. It was subtle, barely visible, a flicker in her expression when the news played certain stories, a tension in her posture when sirens echoed from the street outside. She always changed the channel too quickly, laughed too brightly after. Sometimes, she held her phone too tightly, not like someone waiting for a message, but like someone guarding a secret. She never left it out of sight, never let the screen face up. Once Lily tried to take a photo during breakfast, holding the phone with sticky fingers and joy, but Sophie turned away fast, too fast, her smile faltering just enough to feel like a shadow had passed behind it. Ethan didn't ask, not because he didn't want to, no, but because some questions live better in silence, at least for a while. But silence, like light, reveals what it touches. One night, long after Lily had gone to sleep and the rain had thinned into a soft mist outside, Ethan stepped into the backyard. He had gone out to retrieve a forgotten blanket from the clothesline. That's when he saw her. Sophie stood near the garden wall, barely visible in the moonlight, her shoulders curled inward. Her coat was thin, the kind you throw on when you don't plan to stay long, and yet she had been there for a while. Still quiet, alone. She didn't hear him at first. A breeze passed gently through the trees, and for a moment she looked up, toward the sky, as if searching for something lost beyond the clouds. Then her body shook quietly, like a wave breaking in the dark. Her face turned away, but the sound of her crying was unmistakable. Not loud, not dramatic, but raw, honest. It was the kind of crying that comes when you've held something too long. Ethan froze. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. As if he had accidentally stepped into a sacred space not meant to be witnessed. He took a small step back. Let the shadows have their privacy. She didn't speak of it the next day. She hummed, as she packed Lily's lunch, tied her shoes with practiced grace. Her smile returned, soft and warm, as if nothing had been seen. But Ethan noticed the edges now. The way her eyes were always searching not for beauty, but for exits. The way her fingers trembled ever so slightly when she thought no one watched. He realized then that Sophie wasn't just someone who arrived in the rain. She was the rain gentle, nourishing, but born from something heavy. And still, she gave, every day, with quiet resilience. Ethan didn't press. He didn't ask what haunted her behind that delicate smile, or what ghosts she held at bay while reading Lily bedtime stories. But he began to listen more, to notice, to offer her silence without suspicion, space without judgment. Because sometimes, healing doesn't begin with questions, it begins with being seen. The house was glowing. Strings of golden lights draped the hallway like a quiet celebration of warmth. Balloons, half floating and soft with helium, drifted gently near the ceiling. The scent of vanilla cake lingered in the air, mingling with laughter and candle wax. Lily had turned 6 today. There were presents unwrapped in the corner, little drawings taped to the wall, and ribbons still clinging to the arms of chairs. For a moment, just when the world felt light again, Ethan watched her dance in the living room, cheeks flushed, hands in the air, spinning in circles to music only she could hear. Sophie had planned it all, every detail, the handmade decorations, the way she'd remembered Lily's favorite song, the little paper crown she'd folded from gold foil. She moved through the evening like someone who knew the rhythm of love even if she didn't speak much of her own past. Ethan stood in the doorway, taking it all in. There was something unspoken between them now, a quiet electricity, the kind that hums softly between people who've begun to see each other. Not just for who they are, but for who they've been holding back. Later that night, after the guests had gone and Lily had drifted to sleep with frosting still on her lips, Ethan found Sophie in the kitchen. She was tidying up quietly, always quietly, her back turned, hair slightly undone, sleeves rolled up just enough to show the faint marks of the day. She looked tired but beautiful, the kind of beauty that isn't styled, but earned through small acts of care. He stepped closer, holding a warm mug of tea in both hands. He wanted to thank her for today, for Lily, for everything she brought into their quiet little world. She turned around slowly. Their eyes met in that hush, the one that lives just after music stops and before silence fully settles. He offered the tea. She smiled, soft and tired, and took it. And then something shifted. It wasn't planned, it wasn't dramatic, it was just there. The way his hand brushed against hers, the pause, the quiet intake of breath, the way her gaze held his just a second too long. He moved closer, close enough to see the faintest shimmer at the edge of her eyes, close enough to feel how the moment had stopped tiptoeing and started leaning in. Their faces neared, uncertain but open, and for a fraction of a second, it felt like the air held them together, like time allowed it. But then she pulled away, not angrily, not with rejection, but with something deeper, fear maybe, regret, or something older than either. Her voice was barely a whisper. I can't, I'm not who you think I am. And just like that, she was gone. Not entirely, not yet. But something had closed behind her eyes, a door, a chapter, a name, and before he could ask, before he could even breathe a response, she'd walked past him. The next morning, she didn't come downstairs. Her room was empty. No note, no goodbye. Just the folded gold crown Lily had worn left on the table beside a plate of untouched toast. Ethan checked his phone, then the front door, then the quiet street outside. No sign, no message, nothing but wind against the trees and the echo of something now receding. The first day passed in worry, the second in silence. By the third, he wasn't sure if she was ever coming back. He told Lily that Sophie had to visit someone, that she'd be back soon. But the truth lay heavier in the corners of the house, like an unanswered question that followed them from room to room. Ethan moved through the days like someone carrying something fragile. He didn't know if it was heartbreak, or guilt, or simply confusion. He only knew that her absence was louder than words. And still, he replayed the moment in the kitchen, the almost kiss, the way she'd looked at him before turning away. Not with coldness, but with a kind of sorrow that felt like a story left untold. He had begun to realize something. That sometimes the heart doesn't fear love, it fears being seen. And whatever Sophie had left behind, it wasn't rejection, it was a door still locked from the inside. 3 days passed, and Sophie did not return. Her absence carved itself into the rhythm of the house, like a song missing a note that used to hold the melody together. Lily still asked for her in the morning, her voice soft, hopeful, like maybe Sophie was just late. Like maybe she'd walk through the door with that familiar quiet smile and a story about where she'd been. But the house remained still, and the silence deepened. Ethan hadn't meant to enter her room, not out of curiosity, not even out of worry. But the door stood slightly ajar one evening, inviting and unfinished, like a breath held too long. The room smelled faintly of lavender and rain-dried linen. It was neat, lived in but not revealing. A sweater hung over the back of a chair. A teacup sat by the window. Everything felt paused. He hesitated, then stepped inside. The drawer creaked gently as he opened it, not the top one. The second half stuck, worn at the edges. Inside were ordinary things: a hairbrush, a crumpled scarf, a notebook too worn to read, and then, tucked between old receipts and folded tissue paper, he saw an envelope. Its edges were singed, as if someone had tried to burn it, then changed their mind. The paper was rough, uneven, and smelled faintly of smoke. There was no name, no address, only a photo inside, creased, faded by time. Ethan lifted it slowly. The image held two women, side by side. One of them was unmistakably Sophie, though younger, her hair shorter, her eyes sharper with something unspoken. She wore a prison jumpsuit. The number on her chest blurred slightly in the photos, where beside her stood another woman, older, thin, her eyes hollowed not by age but by something deeper, grief maybe, or guilt. It didn't look like a photo taken of them. It looked like a record, a moment preserved not for memory, but for evidence. Ethan's heart paused. His breath caught, not in fear, but in disbelief. The warmth he had come to know, the softness, the steadiness set clashed against the stark truth staring back from the image. He turned the photo over. There was writing on the back, faint, almost erased. "Forgive me for surviving when she couldn't." And then a voice behind him, gentle but sharp with vulnerability. "Don't look at me differently." Ethan turned. Sophie stood in the doorway, her coat still damp from the outside, hair clinging to her cheeks, but her eyes were steady, tired, yes, but calm, like she'd been expecting this moment. Like she had stopped running. She didn't reach for the photo. She didn't apologize. She simply walked forward and sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slightly curled inward, like someone bracing for a wave they could no longer dodge. The room held its breath. Ethan didn't move. Not yet. He didn't know how. The questions came, unspoken, rising like smoke in his mind. Who was the other woman? What happened? What had Sophie done, or what had been done to her? But the loudest question wasn't about the past, it was about the present. Because even with the photo in his hand, even with the facts cold and inked and captured in faded color, she was still her. The Sophie who braided Lily's hair, who made soup when he forgot to eat, who smiled softly when the sun came through the windows just right. He looked at her. Ellie looked, and in that moment, the lines on the photos seemed to blur. People are not their worst days. They are not a moment captured in judgment, or a name written on a form. They are more than that. They are what they choose after, what they live with, what they carry. Sophie didn't cry. She didn't defend herself. She simply waited, like someone who had been through this before, someone who knew the ache of being seen and then left. But Ethan didn't leave. He lowered the photo, not in dismissal, but in understanding. Quiet understanding. A beginning, maybe not of forgetting, but of knowing and choosing to stay anyway. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows. Inside, the space between them began to shift, with answers, but with the willingness to hold the weight of what had not yet been said. The night was quiet, not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, but the kind that hums beneath the skin. A stillness laced with weight. The kind that comes just before something is revealed. Something long hidden. Ethan sat across from her. But it wasn't a conversation, it was an opening. A door creaking toward a truth Sophie had carried for too long. She held her hands together like a prayer she was afraid to offer. Her eyes moved slowly, like someone sifting through memories not yet ready to let go. And then she spoke. 5 years ago, Sophie's world had split open. She had been engaged, once to a man whose charm had masked something colder. She didn't see it at first, or maybe she did, but mistook it for mystery. He was protective, persuasive, the kind of man who could make a lie sound like love. They lived in a quiet town, rented house with peeling paint and overgrown grass. She worked with children, loved them. She volunteered at shelters, read books out loud with different voices, painted rainbows on their walls. She never saw it coming, not until the day a child vanished. A boy, small, bright eyes. He had played in the corner while she organized storytime crafts, and then he was gone, disappeared like smoke through cracks in the floorboards. The police came, the sirens were loud, so were the questions. At first, Sophie thought she was a witness, a helper. But then they showed her a trail, her fingerprints on the door, her necklace in his backpack, a bank deposit she hadn't made, photos she didn't remember taking. It didn't make sense, but it did to them, and the man she loved, her fiancé, stood silently as they placed cuffs on her wrists. He didn't defend her, didn't speak. He vanished the next day. She spent 3 nights in his cell, 3 nights that felt like the end of every version of her life she had once trusted. The newspapers wrote about her. Neighbors turned their eyes away. She stopped being Sophie. She became the accused. No trial followed. The charges of evidence, insufficient grounds. But the stain remained, because the child was never found. And in the absence of answers, people reached for the most convenient shadow. So she ran. Not because she was guilty, but because the world had already decided she was. Each town after that was a whisper. a borrowed name, a room paid in cash. She stayed nowhere long, never let herself be photographed, never allowed herself to belong. Until Lily, until Ethan. Until the warmth she didn't expect to feel again crept quietly into the edges of her life and asked to stay. Sophie paused, her voice cracking not from volume but from the effort of keeping it steady. She looked down as if bracing for judgment, for retreat, for the sudden sound of footsteps walking away. But Ethan didn't move, because he wasn't listening to a criminal. He was listening to someone who had been broken and never stopped carrying the pieces. The room felt smaller now, not in size but in intimacy, the air thick but shared. And though no verdict was spoken, something deeper happened. Belief. Belief, not offered blindly but with the full weight of seeing someone for who they truly are, not the image, not the rumor, but the presence they bring into a room, the choices they make when no one is watching. Sophie wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, then smiled, small, trembling, not because anything had been fixed, but because something had finally been released. A truth unspoken for 5 years now rested between them, and it did not destroy the quiet. It softened it outside. The wind moved slowly through the trees. A single leaf tapped against the window pane, as if reminding the world that even what falls can still make a sound. Inside, Sophie breathed deeper, and for the first time in years she wasn't running. The rain had softened into a steady whisper, the kind that barely touches the ground, more like memory than weather. Outside, the garden breathed beneath the gray sky. Inside, something fragile and new was taking shape. It had been weeks since Sophie told her story, and in that time the house had learned how to hold her differently, not with suspicion, but with care. The air didn't feel heavier, it felt warmer, more honest. Even Lily seemed to sense the shift. Her drawings grew brighter, her sleep more peaceful. The laughter returned, slowly, gently, like petals unfolding after a long frost. Ethan had spent quiet nights thinking, not about what Sophie had been through, but about what she had survived. He watched her in the mornings, hair still damp from the shower, humming under her breath while packing Lily's lunch. She had a way of turning routine into comfort, of making space feel safe just by existing in it. And somewhere along the line he stopped wondering if he loved her. He simply did. There was no dramatic plan, no perfect moment, just a quiet Sunday, a silver ring, and the stillness between two hearts that knew what it meant to choose each other. Despite the noise of the past, he found her on the back porch, sipping tea, the sky reflecting softly in her eyes. "I don't care where you've been," he said. "Your past doesn't scare me, but losing you does." He held the ring out, not with grand gestures, not with practiced words, just truth, simple and clear. Sophie didn't cry at first. She just looked at him, stunned by the ease in his voice, by the steadiness of someone choosing her, fully, after everything. Then her hands trembled, and when she whispered yes, it wasn't with excitement, it was with relief, the kind that comes from being finally allowed to be loved. Inside, Lily had watched from the window, and when the door opened, she ran forward, arms stretched wide. "Mummy," she squeal, led the word landed like light, not a title, not a name, but a hope made real. Sophie knelt to the floor and held her close, laughter spilling through her tears. And in that moment, the house bloomed. Not in color, not in sound, but in presence. As if all the walls that had once echoed with silence were now learning how to hold joy again. They took a photo that evening, just the three of them. It was simple. Ethan's arm around Sophie, Lily on her shoulders, the garden in the background, and a quiet glow in all their faces. Sophie didn't flinch this time. She didn't turn away from the camera. She let the moment happen. She let herself be seen. Ethan posted it online. A small caption. No big announcement. Just 3 hearts and the word US. And far away, on a cracked phone screen in a forgotten motel room, someone clicked on it. The image loaded slowly. Sophie's face appeared older now, softer but still recognizable. The man staring at the screen didn't smile. His hand hovered over the keyboard, breath caught in his throat. His eyes scanned the photo, taking in every detail. The child, the ring, the man beside her. He leaned back in his chair. The room around him dim and silent. Outside his window, the city moved unaware, but inside, something had stirred. Not regret, not curiosity, but interest. A name he thought he'd buried was alive again. A face he once controlled was smiling on a public screen. He hadn't seen her in 5 years, not since the day he vanished. But Sophie was no longer hiding, and he was watching back at the house. Laughter echoed down the hallway. Lily was singing to herself, playing with ribbons for a pretend wedding. Sophie stood in the kitchen, her hand resting on the counter, eyes closed, soaking in the feeling of being safe. Ethan approached, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin gently on her shoulder. She leaned back into him, and for a moment, just when they believed the past had finally let them go. But some shadows don't leave. They linger quietly, waiting to be seen. The night shimmered with celebration. Soft candlelight danced across white linen. Strings of lights hovered above the garden like quiet stars, draped from tree to tree. Laughter moved gently through the air and hurried warm, the sound of lives leaning into joy. It was their engagement dinner, friends gathered beneath the open sky, Neighbors clinked glasses. Lily ran barefoot through the grass, the hem of her dress catching dew as she twirled and giggled, free in the way only a child can be when she feels truly safe. Sophie stood near the edge of the table, her hand wrapped around a glass of sparkling cider. The night air brushed against her shoulders, and her smile was soft, real, unguarded. Her hair caught the golden glow of string lights. Her laughter came easily now. For a while, everything was perfect. Then, something shifted. It happened quietly. No loud sound, no dramatic change in the music. Just a feeling like the air had changed shape. Sophie's fingers paused against the stem of her glass. Her breath shortened, almost imperceptibly, and her gaze, once carefree, suddenly froze. Across the garden just beyond the reach of the light stood a man, not speaking, not smiling, not clapping with the others, just watching. He was in the back row near the edge of the crowd, a glass in his hand, untouched, his expression unreadable, but Sophie knew, even before his features came fully into focus, her body remembered. Her bones remembered, her heart recognized him like a wound, reopening. Her throat tightened, her vision narrowed, not in panic, but in painful clarity. The sounds of celebration dulled, muffled by the weight of her memory. That was him, the man who had vanished the day she was arrested, the man who said nothing when they dragged her into the back of a squad car, the man who once told her he loved her, even as he destroyed her life. The same calm face, the same watchful eyes, older now, but not changed. Sophie's hands trembled. She turned slowly to Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper, a sentence that felt like glass breaking in her mouth. That's him, that's the man who ruined my life. Ethan followed her gaze, and in that 1 second the warmth of the evening shifted just enough to let something colder in, the way a door left slightly open lets in wind. Not enough to blow out the candles, but enough to be felt. Sophie didn't move. Her feet were heavy, anchored by history, by everything that man still held over her like a shadow that had followed her through time, and finally stepped back into the light. She could barely breathe. He hadn't approached, hadn't made a scene. He just stood there, silent, steady, as if waiting to be acknowledged, as if this too was part of his design, to haunt, not chase, to undo, not confront. Sophie's mind spun through old fears, the police, the media, her freedom, Lily, but more than anything, a familiar voice rose within her, one she thought she'd buried. They'll never believe you. And still, she didn't look away, because this time she wasn't alone. Ethan stood beside her, jaw tight, eyes locked, not in rage, but in something firmer, protective. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence beside her was a kind of answer. The man in the crowd blinked, tilted his head slightly, then, without a word, turned and walked away back into the darkness. No threat, no message, just absence. But Sophie knew what his silence meant. He had found her, the life she was building, the safety, the love, the hope was no longer hidden, and the man who once took everything was watching again. The celebration went on. Laughter rose once more. The lights flickered. Glasses clinked. But inside Sophie, something had shifted. Not the return of fear, but the beginning of something new. Resolved as she turned to Ethan, and though her eyes were wet, they were clear. No longer asking if she was safe, but declaring without a word that she wouldn't run again. Not this time, not anymore. The boutique was quiet, wrapped in soft piano music and the scent of lavender candles. Sunlight filtered in through sheer curtains, casting gentle patterns across polished floors. Everything felt still, like a memory frozen in time. Sophie stood in front of a mirror barefoot, delicate fingers clutching the edge of ivory silk. The dress clung softly to her frame. Layers of lace traced her shoulders, the skirt pooling around her like mist. It wasn't just a dress, it was a symbol of survival, of starting over, of everything she never believed she'd be allowed to have. She smiled faintly behind her. An attendant adjusted the train, another pinned fabric along the side. Compliments floated around her like feathers, soft, encouraging, unreal, but Sophie barely heard them. Her heart was somewhere else. She was thinking of Lily, of Ethan, of the home they had built out of ruins, of mornings filled with sunlight and evenings filled with bedtime stories. She was thinking of what it would feel like to walk down an aisle, not just toward a man, but toward a future finally free of shadows. Then her phone buzzed, a vibration, just one. She reached down slowly, her fingertips brushing the device nestled at the edge of the fitting bench. She wasn't expecting anything urgent, just a message, she thought. Maybe Ethan, asking how the fitting was going. Maybe Lily sending one of her emoji-filled voice notes. But the moment she saw the screen, everything stopped. There were only 6 words. Run, or Lily disappears like the last one. No name, no number. Just those words. Cold, precise, measured. For a moment Sophie didn't move. The silence of the boutique wrapped tighter around her, as if the air itself had frozen in fear. The lights felt too bright, her breath caught in her throat. Her knees weakened, not from panic, but from something older, something familiar. The last one. The child who vanished, the child she couldn't save. The words blurred before her eyes. Her grip on the phone loosened. It slipped from her hand and landed softly on the floor. The screen still glowing, those 6 words staring back at the world. A voice asked if she was okay, but Sophie didn't answer. Her vision narrowed. The corners darkened. Her reflection in the mirror swayed gently, like a ghost trying to hold on. And then, everything went quiet. Her body collapsed in slow motion, the silk of the dress folding around her like a wave. A gasp escaped from the attendants as they rushed to her side, but Sophie didn't hear it. Her mind had already drifted somewhere else, somewhere darker, somewhere familiar, where panic and memory blur, where guilt and fear bleed into one. In the distance, sirens began to echo, not real but remembered. She was back in that police station. The flashing lights, the questions, the disbelief, the feeling of being watched, not heard, judged, not understood, and now it was happening again, but this time it wasn't about her. It was about Lily, the little girl who called her mummy without hesitation, who had trusted her with stories and giggles and scraped knees and bedtime secrets. The child who had brought Sophie back to life, and who now hung in the balance of a cruel, invisible game. Back in the boutique, her eyes flickered open. Blurry shapes moved above her. Someone held her wrist, someone whispered for her to stay calm. But Sophie didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just whispered one word again and again. Lily, Lily, because that's all that mattered now. Not the wedding, not the past, not the fear she'd spent years trying to outrun. Just Lily, and the promise she had made, silently each night beside her bed, that no harm would ever come to the child who saved her. The phone lay nearby, face up on the floor, the message still glowing like a threat carved into glass. Run, or Lily disappears like the last one outside. Clouds gathered, the sunlight dimmed, the music in the boutique faded beneath the weight of a new reality. The past wasn't done with Sophie, and this time, it wasn't asking her to run, it was daring her to stay. The church stood quietly under a gray sky. Its old stone walls, softened by moss and time, seemed to hold their breath. Inside, pews were dressed in soft ribbons. Candles flickered down the aisle. Every surface whispered tradition, timeless, sacred, still, but beneath the calm, tension hummed. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a trap. Ethan had made the call 2 days ago, his voice steady, his decision clear. No more hiding, no more fear. If the man watching them wanted to finish what he started, then let him try. But this time, they would be ready. The private investigator moved through the chapel like a shadow. A subtle alert, rehearsed. Cameras were tucked into hymnals, microphones hidden in the floral arrangements. Staff had been briefed. A signal word had been chosen. And behind every gentle smile was a silent question. Is it you? Each guest was another possibility. A friend, a stranger, a threat. Sophie knew the man would come. She could feel it, not in certainty, but in instinct. Some bonds, even twisted ones, leave echoes that can't be shaken. He wouldn't let her go that easily, not now, not when she had finally built a life beyond his reach. And so, the wedding became a performance, a beautiful one. Lily twirled in her white shoes, unaware of the danger threaded into the day. Her dress swayed with innocence, her eyes sparkled with joy. Sophie hadn't told her anything. Children shouldn't carry fear. But she held Lily's hand tighter than ever before, never letting go, not for a moment. The church filled slowly, family, neighbors, distant cousins, their faces blurred into a soft mosaic of expressions. Some smiled, some whispered, some watched too closely. Sophie's heart counted every glance, every pocketed phone, every guest who arrived alone. The music drifted overhead, too gentle to calm her. She stood in the back room, veil resting on her lap, her breath shallow. This wasn't how she imagined. Her wedding, not like this. Not with the weight of the past stalking the aisles, not with fear tucked beneath her dress like a second skin. But then again, nothing about her story had followed a script. Why should this? Ethan entered quietly, dressed in a dark suit, eyes soft but firm. He said nothing, just knelt and touched Lily's shoulder, then turned to Sophie and held her gaze. It wasn't reassurance, it was a promise. We're in this together. Outside, the investigator checked the final feed. Camera 1, front entrance. Camera 2, side hallway. Camera 3, balcony, and then camera 4. Movement. A man in a brown jacket, hat low, no invitation, no name at the guest table. He took a seat near the back, not near anyone, not smiling. The alert was silent too. Plainclothes officers adjusted positions. But the ceremony had to begin. The music swelled. Doors opened. Sophie walked down the aisle. Her steps were slow, steady, every footfall echoing louder than her heart. Lily held her hand, skipping slightly, a flower tucked behind her ear. Guests turned and smiled. Phones rose. Tears welled. But Sophie saw only one thing. The man, sitting calmly, watching. Her not blinking. Her grip tightened on Lily's hand. She couldn't stop walking. Not now. Not when every eye was on her. But every step felt like walking toward a cliff's edge. Was he armed? Was he alone? Would he act here? Now, the altar came into view. Ethan waited, his hands folded, eyes only on her. She reached him, and for a moment the world narrowed to the three of them. A triangle of trust, of love, of protection. The priest spoke, but Sophie didn't hear. She only heard her breath, the soft shift of fabric, the creak of the wooden pew behind her. Every sound was a thread being pulled tighter. and then a signal. A man coughed loudly in the back. The wrong man. The real threat was already moving near the side door. A flash of movement. The investigator was faster. 2 officers intercepted quietly. No screams, no panic, just precision. A hand on the shoulder. A quiet detain. A moment later, the man was gone. Sophie didn't flinch. She looked back, saw the pew empty, saw the back door shut, and then she breathed. Not fully, but enough. Lily still smiled, playing with her ring. Ethan reached for Sophie's hand, and they said their vows. Not to forget what had happened, but to survive it. The chapel was drenched in golden light. Outside, clouds held their breath. Inside, love was being spoken aloud, vows not just of devotion, but of survival, of faith, of 2 people promising to hold each other. Even in the shadow of what had once tried to destroy them, Sophie's voice trembled, not from fear but from at how far they had come, at the miracle of standing here, alive, loved, and still unbroken. Ethan held her hands gently. His vows came like soft thunder, quiet, steady, unshakable. Lily stood beside them, her small hands clutching petals, her eyes wide with wonder. The priest smiled. The room hushed. Time seemed to pause, hovering on the edge of something beautiful, and then shattered. It happened in the space between a heartbeat and a breath, a blur of movement from the crowd, fast, sharp, unnatural. Chairs scraped, a sharp gasp. Sophie's eyes locked onto the figure as it broke free from the back pew, the man, not the decoy. Him, unfolding from the aisle like a blade, eyes wild, jaw clenched, arms outstretched, not for Sophie, for Lily. Sophie screamed. Lily froze. Ethan didn't think. His body moved before his mind did. Muscle, instinct, protection. He lunged, arms colliding midair with the man, both of them crashing to the floor just inches from the child. The room erupted. Screams echoed off stained glass. Chairs fell. The priest stepped back, stunned. Flower petals flew as guests rushed to shield their children. Camera flashes burst through the chaos like lightning. Sophie grabbed Lily, wrapping her arms around her like armor. She pulled her back away, toward the side of the altar, away from the man who had once held her life in his hands and now tried to steal the only thing that mattered. On the floor, Ethan held the man down, his knuckles white, jaw tight. The man twisted, snarled, words slurring in fury. But Ethan didn't let go. Doors burst open. Police swept in, shouting, commanding. And then, the weight lifted. Officers pulled the man back, pinned him down, hands behind his back, a gun clattering, to the chapel floor. Sirens wailed outside, late but loud. Red and blue light poured through the stained glass windows, bathing the room in emergency. And just like that, the wedding stopped. Silence lingered after the storm. Only the soft sobs of a child filled the air now, muffled against Sophie's chest. The guests stood in stunned disbelief. What had moments ago been a sanctuary of joy was now a crime scene. A fractured dream, caught in the crosswinds of past and present. The aisle, once lined with roses, was now scattered with chaos. Sophie knelt beside Ethan, who sat on the floor, breathing hard, his shirt torn at the collar. His hands scraped. They didn't speak. Their eyes met, and in that gaze was everything: shock, terror, love, and something else. Survival. They had survived again. Not because they were lucky, not because fate was kind, but because they refused to be broken. Because love, when it is deep and true, is not gentle. It is fierce. And today, that love had protected a child from becoming another name in a file, another photograph on a wall. Lily looked up, her cheeks damped. She didn't speak either. She just held tighter to Sophie's hand, and that was enough. Outside, reporters were already gathering. Cameras flashed through the church doors, their curiosity feeding on tragedy. But inside, there was only quiet now. The priest slowly stepped forward, unsure if the ceremony should continue. But Sophie stood, not because she was ready, but because she was done running. Her dress was no longer perfect. A small tear at the hem, a speck of blood on the lace from where Ethan had scraped his hand. But still, she stood, and Ethan joined her. He reached for her hand, not to finish the ceremony now, but to hold the moment, to remind her, and himself, that even as the world tried to pull them apart, they were still here, still holding on, still choosing each other. The guests remained seated, watching in respectful silence. No more applause, no more music, just quiet awe. And in that moment, as sirens faded and flashbulbs cooled, the three of them, Sophie, Ethan, and Lily, walked back down the aisle. Not as a fairy tale, but as something more powerful, as a family. The news broke before the sun rose, flashing across screens, filling headlines, carving Sophie's name into places it was never meant to be, not in celebration, but in suspicion. Runaway nanny or framed survivor. Engagement turns violent, shocking past, resurfaces woman once accused in child, to disappearance back in custody. The photos spread quickly. Grainy screenshots from the wedding. Sophie being led out of the church, not in a dress but in silence. Not in shame but in disbelief. Because even now, even after everything, the world didn't ask what really happened, it just asked what looked true. Ethan watched from the waiting room of the precinct, a small television bolted to the corner wall. We played the same loop over and over, Sophie's face blurred behind red and blue lights, her expression unreadable, her name said with question marks, not compassion. He sat with his hands clasped, eyes fixed, jaw tight. Lily was home, safe, with a neighbor, too young to understand the noise outside, too innocent to know that sometimes the truth isn't loud enough to drown out doubt. Inside the interrogation room, Sophie sat beneath a harsh light, bright, cold, deliberate. They weren't unkind, but they weren't warm either. Questions came like raindrops, constant, direct, quietly suspicious. Her history, her disappearance, the arrest years ago, her relationship with the man, why she didn't come forward, why she ran, why she hid. And always the undertone. If you're innocent, why did you disappear? She answered calmly, clearly, honestly. The truth had already been spoken. Now it was only being repeated. Yes, she was arrested. Yes, she was cleared. No, she never trusted the system again, because it hadn't protected her, because it didn't listen the first time, because running had felt safer than silence. But now she was tired of running. She told them everything. Again. About the child who vanished, about the fiancé who framed her, about the message at the dress shop, the trap at the wedding, the moment that man lunged at Lily with the same emptiness in his eyes that once haunted her. Nightmares. She didn't cry, but her voice did crack. Not for herself, for Lily. She leaned forward across the cold metal table and said it plainly. That would never hurt a child. I would die to protect one. In another room, officers reviewed footage, surveillance from the chapel, messages from Sophie's phone, the anonymous threats, the private investigator's report. Slowly, pieces began to fall into place. The story she told, once unbelievable, now looked less like a fabrication and more like a tragedy long ignored. Still, the headlines didn't wait for truth. They never do. By evening, her photo had been plastered across news sites alongside older mugshots from the past. One moment of her life, frozen in the worst possible light, reanimated for a world hungry for drama. People commented without knowing her, judged without asking. And Ethan could only watch. He stood in the hallway as reporters gathered outside the station, cameras aimed like weapons, their microphones fishing for scandal. He clenched his fists but didn't speak, because what could he say that the world hadn't already twisted? Inside, Sophie sat alone again. A different room now, softer walls, a kinder voice. The lead detective this time was different, older, quieter, a father himself. He had read her file. He had watched the footage. He had heard the scream in her voice when she shouted for Lily, and he believed her. But belief wasn't enough to erase suspicion. Not yet. Not in a world where guilt follows faster than facts. They released her later that night. No charges, no apologies. Just a quiet exit through the back door, away from the flashing lights. Ethan met her with a coat. A car door already open. They didn't hug. They just sat together, side by side, hands close but not touching it, carrying a silence too heavy for words. The drive home was long. The city passed like a blur, headlights and shadows, and neon flickering like old wounds. Sophie leaned her head against the window, eyes open but distant. Ethan drove with one hand, the other resting between them, waiting. When they reached the driveway, Lily was asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, a book resting on her chest. Sophie knelt beside her and kissed her forehead, holding there just a moment longer than usual, and as she rose, she whispered to herself, not in fear, but in defiance, "They won't take this from me, not again." Because now, the world knew her name, and this time, she wouldn't let them define it. The air was cold, but the night held its breath with gentleness, the kind of stillness that comes after a storm, not empty, not silent, but aware that something had passed through and left the world slightly different, softer in some places, sharper in others. Sophie stepped out of the car and into the dusk. No handcuffs, no whispers, no shadows following her heels, just breath, and earth, and the quiet hum of home. It had taken weeks of interviews, testimonies, footage, and statements. The truth was slow, reluctant, but it came. The man who had stalked her now behind bars. The messages traced. Her innocence, once drowned in doubt, now surfaced in the light of evidence. The media moved on eventually, as it always does. Another scandal, another face, another story to chew. But for Sophie it wasn't over. It never would be. The world may have dropped her name, but she would always carry what it tried to stain. The door opened before she could knock. And Lily ran, small arms flying forward like wings, bare feet against the floor, eyes wide with tears and joy braided together. The sound she made wasn't a word, it was a release, a breath held too long, a heart too young to understand everything but old enough to feel everything. Sophie dropped to her knees and caught her. They stayed there, tangled together, one crying, one whispering, "I missed you," over and over. Ethan stood behind them, quiet, watching. Not as a protector this time, but as a witness to something holy. Love returning home later that evening. The sun dropped below the trees and Ethan lit a small fire in the backyard. The flames rose, gently, no drama, no roar, just a steady glow that warmed the dark. He brought out a folded envelope. Old newspaper clippings, tabloid headlines, printed whispers, the photos, the ones they had all seen, the ones that tried to define her. Sophie stood beside him, hands in her coat pockets, her breath visible in the cool air. He looked at her, held her gaze and said softly, "Let's make a new name." Then he dropped the envelope into the fire. Flames kissed the paper, curling the edges, darkening the ink. The headlines melted into ash. Her face, the one they used without consent, flickered, then disappeared. Sophie didn't cry, she just watched, because this time, she wasn't mourning what was taken. She was releasing what never belonged to her. The fire crackled. Lily came out with a blanket draped around her shoulders, rubbing her eyes. Sophie picked her up, and the child leaned into her chest. Sleep trying to pull her under, but peace holding her close. They sat together, mother, father, daughter, beneath the open sky, lit only by firelight and memory. There was no celebration, just stillness. No big declaration. Just forgiveness. Not for the world. Not even for the man who caused the chaos, but for the girl. Sophie used to be the one who thought she had to disappear to be safe. The one who believed she would always be alone. The one who forgot for a while that even a shattered name can still be spoken with love. Ethan reached for her hand beneath the blanket, and for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, Sophie allowed herself to exhale, truly, fully, without fear. The trees swayed gently overhead. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, a plane hummed across the stars. But here, in this yard, beneath this sky, next to this fire, a chapter had ended, and something new was beginning. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in soft layers of gold and rose. It was the kind of evening that didn't ask for attention. It just was, quiet, steady, honest. In the backyard, fairy lights blinked gently between tree branches. Simple chairs lined the garden path, their wooden frames warmed by the late summer air. A single table held a bouquet of wildflowers, nothing extravagant, nothing loud. Just enough. Sophie stood barefoot on the grass, her dress light and flowing, like the wind had woven it from breath and time. Ethan waited beneath the oak tree, his tie slightly crooked, his smile softer than sunlight. Not because he was nervous, but because he was present, fully, completely here, and between them stood Lily, holding both their hands. Her curls were tied with a ribbon that matched the sky. Her tiny shoes left marks in the soft earth, as if nature itself wanted to remember this day, and in her other hand she clutched 2 silver rings tied together with a loop of string. There was no priest, no crowd, no script. Just vows whispered beneath the breath of trees. Vows not built from fairy tales or fantasies, but from fire and forgiveness. From sleepless nights and whispered truths. From survival. From love, not just chosen, but earned. Sophie looked at Ethan, her eyes deep with the kind of stillness that only comes after a long, hard storm. Not empty, not tired, just whole. He spoke first, quietly, gently, no need to project. This moment wasn't for the world, it was just for them. Then Sophie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried through the yard, through the memory of everything they had endured, through the weight of every name she'd been called, and every one she'd shed. When it was time, Lily stepped forward with the rings, and they slipped them on with shaking hands. Not from fear, but from the realization that this was what peace could look like. When the final words were spoken, Sophie leaned in, forehead resting against Ethan's, Lily's hand still between theirs, and softly, almost to herself, she whispered, "This time, I chose my own ending." No one clapped, no one cheered, but somewhere, a breeze moved through the garden like an exhale. And the world felt lighter as the sun dipped behind the trees. Guests slowly rose from their chairs, just a few close friends, the kind who stayed through the storm. They offered hugs, quiet tears, shy smiles, but no one stayed long. They knew this wasn't the kind of celebration that needed noise, it was the kind that needed space. By nightfall, the yard was emptied, and except for the 3 of them, Lily chased fireflies beneath the low-hanging string lights. Her laughter floated through the dark like a lullaby written just for them. Ethan built a small fire in the pit, and Sophie sat beside it, gown trailing in the grass, her hair loose around her shoulders. She touched the ring on her finger, turned it slowly, not as a symbol of being claimed, but of being seen. Loved not in spite of her past, but through it. Her last name had changed, not to hide, not to start over, but to begin, truly, this time with choice, not fear. She wasn't erasing anything, she was adding something. A name she chose, a family she built, a life she claimed with her whole heart. Ethan passed her a blanket. She tucked it around her shoulders. Lily crawled into her lap, already sleepy, thumb brushing her cheek. They sat together, surrounded by silence and stars. The fire crackled, and for the first time in a very, very long time, there was nothing chasing her. No shadows at the edge of the frame. No echoes in the dark. Just the sound of a home breathing, a child dreaming, a love that wasn't perfect but was true. Sophie looked up at the sky. No wishes, no what-ifs. No what-ifs. And finally, peace.